In the US, not being white is the defining characteristic. But in Brazil, which is a highly mixed race country, not being black is a defining characteristic. Do you see what I mean here?
I do, yeah.
In the US, being white puts you in the top of the social hierarchy. But in Brazil, not being black is what moves you up in the racial hierarchy.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean Fettig. I'm a political scientist, and I'm interested in how our government and our politicians influence our lives, but also how our personal stories influence our politics. In this podcast, I may focus on topics in the news, but this is not punditry. Instead, I dive deep into issues and stories with my guests, behind the headlines, beyond the basic narrative that is often crafted by the media and our politicians, to help us better understand each other and why we think and feel the ways we do. On Sunday, October 2nd, Brazilians will cast their vote in the presidential election. While there are a number of candidates, their primary choices will be between first-term incumbent conservative right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro and former left-wing President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known affectionately as Lula. Unlike the trend we've been seeing the world over, but particularly in Europe and the United States recently, the left is doing particularly well in Brazil, representing a potential fatigue with the far-right nationalist policies of the Bolsonaro administration, which oversaw the unprecedented destruction of huge swaths of the Amazon, inequitable treatment, almost disdain for indigenous peoples and their autonomy, a massive death toll attributed to the country's weak response to COVID, and personal investigations into the Bolsonaro family's business dealings. If no candidate achieves greater than 50% of the total vote on October 2nd, the top two vote-getters will advance to a second round of voting on October 30th. At this stage, as I said, most signs suggest that Lula and Bolsonaro will advance to the second round, with neither winning an outright victory on October 2nd. As of right now, at the time of the recording of this episode, September 26th, polls lead us to believe that the left has reason to be optimistic, with Lula leading Bolsonaro, in some cases pretty significantly. But the polls are tightening somewhat, and Bolsonaro has been laying the groundwork for a contested outcome, taking a page out of the Trump playbook, suggesting that the election will be rigged and that he may not accept the outcome. Today I'm talking to Dr. Robert Vidigal, out of the Center for Social Media and Politics at New York University. Dr. Vidigal's research focuses on how social and cognitive motivations influence political behavior and knowledge, and he's an expert on Brazilian politics. His work has appeared in numerous journals and books in both the United States and Brazil. Dr. Vidigal and I share a research interest, so our conversation gives me the opportunity to geek out a bit. We talk about the authoritarian tendency, how we measure it in people, and how we might better measure it. And we also talk about the upcoming election in Brazil, what influences voters, if Bolsonaro might contest the election, and what might happen if he does. I'd like to ask that if you enjoy this podcast, or you think that a friend of yours might enjoy it, or even just a particular episode, please do share it with them, or give it a like on your favorite podcast platform. It really does help to spread the word. You can also follow the podcast on Instagram at Deep Dive with Sean, on Twitter at Deep Dive Sean, and or subscribe to Deep Dive with Sean C. Fettig at YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Let's do a deep dive. Dr. Vidigal, thanks for being here. How are you?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm well too, thanks. So, can you explain authoritarian tendencies and then maybe also in doing so how they influence voter attitudes?
Sure. So I will talk about the conceptualization and the measurement jointly. Okay. Authoritarian tendencies or authoritarian orientations is a concept that has been theorized for over 70 years among psychologists and political scientists. So I should note here that I'm talking about authoritarianism as a psychological, individual level variable rather than a feature of political system. That being said, the theoretical springboard for this psychological construct has been the book The Authoritarian Personality from Theodor Adorno and colleagues from 1950, where they introduced the so-called F scale. And F stands for fascism scale. So originally, the concept of authoritarianism was developed to explain an individual's adherence to anti-democratic, totalitarian, and intolerant ideologies. But the concept evolved a lot over the decades, since the 70 years, especially with psychologists Bob Altmaier and John Duckett, who refined this concept a lot in the late 80s and 90s. Bob Altmaier's new measurement proposition, the right-wing authoritarianism scale, the RWA, was better than the F scale, but still suffered from a series of problems. Despite all these shortcomings across scales, one common thread across these works is that authoritarian orientations are related to child rearing practices. In other words, how to bring up or socialize children in society. Mm-hmm. So around this idea, we get to a new conceptualization of authoritarianism by the political psychologist Stanley Feldman at Stony Brook University. I like to explain his theory of authoritarianism as a theory of social conformity. So as Feldman argues, people who desire social conformity should want children to be taught to be good and obedient citizens. Authoritarians believe that it's best for children to be obedient, not challenge authority, and accept the way society is. So this type of conformist orientation includes also an unwillingness to allow others to step out of narrowly defined terms and limits of what is proper and acceptable in society. On the other hand, those who value individual autonomy should want to encourage in their children. So the children should be independent, responsible, creative, and curious. When we think about these two poles of the authoritarianism orientations, we can define authoritarian orientations as anchored between these two poles in a continuum, right? So one emphasizes individual autonomy, freedom, and social change. And on the other extreme, we have people that prefer social conformity, obedience, and respect for the social order. The opposing nature of these normative views about society leads people who are at the opposite ends of this continuum to display very different political attitudes and behavior. To start summarizing this idea, an individual's position in this authoritarian continuum is determined by the degree to which they endorse the personal autonomy versus the strict conformity to societal norms. This is mainly why authoritarianism explains a series of social and political conservative attitudes, as well as attitudes towards the use of force. So now, talking more deeply about the measurement, the child rearing measurement is chosen because it's exogenous to this wide variety of political attitudes. So past research has shown that it has temporal stability, it has the ability to measure authoritarian political thinking, and multiple authors have shown this since the 90s, that these parental values, right, another way to call this scale, they are reliable and a valid measure. And I showed that this also works within the Brazilian context. Now, how do we efficiently measure these authoritarian orientations, right? So it basically hinges on making people choose one characteristic or value that they prefer to a children over another value. So, for example, the question asks if they prefer a child to be independent or to respect the elderly. They prefer a children to be creative or to be discipline. So we present to respondent these pairs of values, and these value pairs, they're not strict opposites, but they make respondents choose between competing goals. Okay, so only individuals with authoritarian tendencies would be willing to choose social conformity and sacrifice their individual autonomy. In other words, these parental values allows us to distinguish the authoritarian predispositions from the authoritarian outcomes or authoritarian products, which these two previous scales could not do. Now, how can influence behavior? Here's, I guess you were thinking about the predicting effect of authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. That's when things become more nuanced, because the effect of authoritarianism on voting behavior is expected to vary across context and time. Changes in the political context can connect authoritarianism or disconnect from politics. It's not always that authoritarianism will exert some influence on elections. So the literature has shown that in conditions of social stability, the divide between authoritarians and non-authoritarians is not really large or salient, but in conditions of crisis, leaders with authoritarian inclinations can build an electoral base by reaching out to different voters or emphasizing different policies that authoritarians value.
So you mentioned something that I want to circle back to and maybe dig a bit into.
Yeah.
I've always thought these were odd proxies. You've used them, mm-hmm. I've used them. Multiple researchers have used them, specific to the United States, which is some measure of attitudes towards, child rearing or beliefs about how children should behave or conform.
Yeah.
Sometimes I've seen if the words of the Bible should be literally implemented in law. But what seems to matter to me, though, is how much someone is willing to enforce that behavior.
Yes.
Or what someone is willing to do to achieve their preferred outcome. I could imagine that somebody would prefer that their child be conformist and yet is unwilling to inflict corporal punishment to do that. And these, to me, are two very different concepts.
Yes.
And I don't know how comfortable I would be willing to say that somebody is exhibiting authoritarian tendencies just because they want their child to be conformist, but are unwilling to force that onto the child. If you agree that these are distinct, then what has been done to more directly measure this phenomenon, or what could be done?
Yeah, so we should not think in terms of black and white. So authoritarian tendencies is more, like I said, is a continuum, right? People might range from, let's say, 0 to 4 on authoritarianism, or 0 to 7, or 0 to 3, depending the length of the scale that we use. Mm-hmm. But the main reason why we use this parental values or child rearing scale is because it's a scale that's not political, right? If we think about the items that were used in the RWA or the F scale, you have items such as what the country needs is a strong, determined leader who will crush evil and takes us back to our true path. Mm-hmm. Or they have something like, the only way our country can get through a crisis is to go back to our traditional values, put tough leaders in power, or the will of the majority should always prevail, or the Bible one that you mentioned, or they ask items about gays and lesbians, they ask items about atheists, they ask questions about like sexual preferences, preference for the old-fashioned ways. So all these items, they're like so heavily in political content, and it becomes weird to use an attitude to predict another attitude, right? So we're using a political attitude to predict another political attitude.
Mm-hmm, right.
So the best measure that we have nowadays is actually the child rearing, because it's a question about values about kids, And surprisingly, these items, they predict a lot of political outcomes. So since the first book on authoritarianism that I mentioned from Adorno, there is this idea behind conformity and enforcing social conformity in kids. Mm-hmm. Because the main reason that like Feldman says is that how to bring up a kid or how to socialize a kid has a lot of consequences for social behavior. And when we think about politics is largely a social behavior, right? It's a behavior among groups competing for elections. So trying to circle back, using this apolitical scale brings the necessary exogeneity to predict political outcomes. And it works.
In some of your work, you examine the relationship between inclination toward authoritarianism and then, subsequent support for far-right leadership. So I have some questions here for you.
Yeah.
Because to me, authoritarianism could be characterized not exclusively, but perhaps in part as, a very selfish pursuit of one's own goals that embedded into that process is exertion of raw power over someone else or perhaps someone else's goals. And to me, I mean, we could have the discussion about whether or not there is anything fundamentally redeeming and legitimizing about a form of government like that, at least as it stands in contrast to democracy or, some version of democracy. But if we can, suspend all other characteristics of authoritarianism and just, imagine this as being, a pursuit of raw power over others, then I guess this may seem obvious, but generally, what is the allure of authoritarianism if it isn't socially cohesive?
That's a good question. I think I would not put authoritarian orientations, inclinations in these terms of selfish pursuit of one's goals, since it sounds more like individualism. Mm-hmm. And also because the measurement strategy that I use and is being used in the literature does not really tap or measures these like individualistic or self-centered goals. So the core tenet of authoritarianism is as a social orientation is this preference for social conformity, right? So authoritarians tend to be social conformists and expect others to conform to the established social norms, right? So they're not only social conformists themselves, but they also want the others to be. So let's take the example of sexuality and gender norms. Mm-hmm. So because lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transsexuals individuals fail to conform to the existing social conventions regarding sexual behavior, authoritarians are inclined to dislike such individuals and be less supportive of gay rights initiatives. So this conformist orientation includes this unwillingness to allow others to step out of the societal defined limits of what's proper and acceptable. So I think it's less about individuality and more about normative views about how society should be. So namely, authoritarians believe that citizens should be obedient, not challenge the established authorities, and simply accept the way society is. So this implies not only intolerance of social and political behaviors that do not match the status quo, but also intolerance of any belief thought to be threatening to the societal status quo.
So something that I've experienced in conversation with folks, and it seems to be true of political scientists, even historians that are studying this, is that there was almost accepted that in the United States, perhaps this is also true in Brazil, there's always been this subsection of the population that was particularly maybe misogynistic, particularly homophobic, particularly traditional, for lack of a better way of saying it, but that it was relatively latent. And as a result, I think we were all pretty surprised in the United States to see what and how fervently Donald Trump was tapping into something that became really powerful really quickly. And Bolsonaro did the same thing in Brazil. I know that, Bolsonaro is referred to as Brazil's Trump, and I would almost, to some degree, at this point, argue that Trump is the United States Bolsonaro. and we can talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I am wondering what your thoughts are about, did we just get it wrong that this was some latent minority part of the population? Or did they really inflame something that would otherwise have stayed latent?
Yeah, so I guess I have to talk about the authoritarian dynamic theory, which is this idea that authoritarianism exists in different societies. It varies across time, it varies across context, but is not politically relevant in a vacuum. But it becomes relevant when political contestation, political events, and elites activate it. So there is this big puzzle in the authoritarianism literature about activating authoritarianism inclinations predisposition, right? Because since this is a psychological characteristic, so that's relatively stable and that exists. But again, it's not every time that it will play a role in elections and in politics, right? And there is a large literature that tries to explore from where this psychological orientations comes from. So evolutionary psychology tries to tap that. Sociology tries to tap that. But if I was to summarize all the research in authoritarianism in American politics, I guess the main conclusion that I would say is that those voters who are high in authoritarianism have socially sorted into the Republican Party, since this is the party that matches their societal worldviews. So I would say that's the main takeaway, that, as you said, that probably always exists in American politics, but just recently that these authoritarian voters sorted into the Republican Party. And now, to going back to the authoritarian dynamic puzzle, that's a $1 million question. If these politicians are activating these tendencies in voters for their own political gain.
So something very similar happened in Brazil as happened in the United States. We had relatively liberal governments that then gave way to strongly conservative governments, right? So we had Barack Obama in the United States, followed by Donald Trump, which is, to the average person, mind-boggling, right? Like it's really difficult to explain what's happening in American politics if you're not, steeped in it. And I think even if you are, it's kind of head-scratching, right? And then the same happened in Brazil. I mean, arguably, had Lula not been sent to prison, maybe Bolsonaro would never have been elected in the first place.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, right? Like we had Lula and then Bolsonaro, who was a dramatic swing. And so I guess I'm wondering if you could talk about, specific to Brazil, the rise of authoritarianism and right-wing politics in recent years.
Sure. Yeah. So in Brazil, I guess, so there's research showing an increase in the number of individuals reporting a right-wing ideology in different surveys in the country. So you see that in the Brazilian electoral study, you see that in the Latin American Public Opinion Project, you see that in the Brazilian election opinion study. So different surveys are finding the same result, that there is a higher number of individuals reporting a right-wing ideology. But these findings, they raise several questions about the voters' ideology positions. So the first one would be, is the voters' ideological self-placement changing? Or is it the symbolic meaning of left and right labels changing among these Brazilian voters. So one potential explanation for these new patterns is Bolsonaro, right? So, and I say it's Bolsonaro because in Brazil, in the past, there is this past association between the authoritarian military regime and the right. So this association about the military regime with the right generated this phenomena in Brazilian politics, which is called a shame right. So it's the Brazilian elites who are right wing that they avoid to use the label right. I'm a right wing politician. I'm a rightist politician. So different scholars have pointed to that. And what changes now is that Bolsonaro, it's simply the antithesis of this tendency. He is an openly far-right politician with a comprehensive right-wing agenda and rhetoric. Bolsonaro always made crystal clear that he's a right-wing politician and that he's unapologetic about it. Mm-hmm. So my hypothesis here is that Bolsonaro likely provided this ideological packaging necessary for certain voters to understand their own belief system structure as right-leaning, or he simply provided the social identity cue for voters to recognize themselves as being right-wing. But overall, I think that Bolsonaro did not have to convince these authoritarian voters specifically about his political positions, but rather his message was aligned with what such voters wanted to hear regarding societal worldviews and moral issues. So as a result, when we ask people to place themselves within the left or right spectrum, more individuals might express a self-reported symbolic ideology in the polls. But still, we still need more research to investigate these patterns in the ideological self-placement and the public opinion connotations of these ideological labels in Brazil.
We touched on a minute ago, I had referenced how Bolsonaro is characterized as Brazil's Trump, and that I'm not so sure that I buy that direction of the relationship, because in some ways I almost feel like Bolsonaro is more overtly offensive. Mm-hmm. But I am not particularly familiar with Brazilian politics. But there do seem to be like some personal attributes of Bolsonaro's that maybe coupled with some aspects of Brazilian culture foster, to me, what seems to be a more directly threatening component to his rhetoric and behavior. And for instance, like while, Donald Trump definitely raised the heat on misogynistic language in the United States, and he tapped into some toxic masculinity, and, he still kept his language somewhat coded. And he was always ambiguous enough to, pull back. Like, that's not what I meant, Yeah. Whereas Bolsonaro has been filmed, like telling a woman that she doesn't deserve to be raped. He's physically pushed a female legislator, and he's made references in rallies to the fact that his erection never goes away.
Yeah.
This is much more, it seems to be trading on who they are more so than what their policies are. Right, both Bolsonaro and Trump. But I'm wondering, from the Brazilian side, what is he tapping into with his electorate that is so animating, that is beyond just his policies in doing this? Because even in the United States, in the post-Trump era, where we've all been kind of hardened to this kind of language and behavior, I think this is still shocking. And I don't know how it plays in Brazil.
Yeah, one really important characteristic of authoritarianism is that authoritarians, they're much more likely to support the use of force and power and punitive responses. So that includes corporal punishment and in some cases, even support for the death penalty. So the literature finds strong correlations between these categories of attitudes and authoritarian orientations. So what Bolsonaro, I guess, is tapping there with all this language is that he has these strong main tactics because using this like use of force, power, punitive responses, these tactics are necessary to confront the bad actors in the society. So what Bolsonaro is mostly tapping in is voters' fears and trying to signal to the electorate that the society is under threat. And threat is the main mechanism to activate authoritarian orientations. So authoritarians, they have higher perceptions of threat and they care more about their personal security. So gun ownership, for example, tends to be viewed by them as a way to provide protection for oneself. So in Brazil, Bolsonaro favors relaxing regulation on gun control and also allowing citizens to own and carry guns for self-defense. And he also sometimes taps on extreme measures to punish those who violate laws. So another example is the death penalty, which is a long unused form of punishment in Brazil. But Bolsonaro openly supports the revival of death penalty for violent crimes and also life imprisonment. So there is evidence that authoritarian citizens in Latin America support policies and crime control measures that violate human rights of criminal suspects and other marginalized groups. So when we get to the electoral context, it's not surprising that this preference for strong main tactics shows up as support for these authoritarian candidates because they're viewed as powerful and forceful because of they have a higher propensity to suppress nonconformity in society. So believe that Bolsonaro is very extreme in his rhetoric because he's trying to tap in all of these like citizens' fears and threat in society.
I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the influence of race in our politics and in Brazil's politics. So race in the United States is unique in our politics in ways that right-wing parties aren't capitalizing in the same ways in places like Europe.
Yeah.
Perhaps there's some type of an intersection with immigration, but U.S. history related to race is unique, and it's a significant element of politics in the United States. One corollary I do see in politics, though, is how race figures into politics in Brazil.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about this, and how is the right wing tapped into this, and how does race activate these voters?
Sure. So I guess race is not starkly different from American politics because race in Brazil is a major variable in predicting and explaining political behavior. So there is a large empirical record of the effect of negative racial attitudes on Brazilian politics. But there is a major context distinction here that I should note. Where in the US, not being white is the defining characteristic. But in Brazil, which is a highly mixed race country, not being black is a defining characteristic. Do you see what I mean here?
I do, yeah.
In the US, being white puts you in the top of the social hierarchy. But in Brazil, not being black is what moves you up in the racial hierarchy. Also, in the US, I believe African Americans are roughly 12, 13% of the population. In Brazil, depending how you ask or how people define themselves, you can reach up to 54% of the population. So almost 5 times the African American population. So there is evidence of race affecting voting behavior in Brazil, with blacks voting for left-wing candidates and whites for right-wing candidates, such as Bolsonaro. But the thing is that race in Brazil is highly correlated with income, and that muddles the waters a lot when we're trying to explain behavior and attitudes in the country only by race differences. Now, the bulk of my past research on race and politics in Brazil has been on how negative racial attitudes affect affirmative action among those who are mostly most directly impacted by such policies, which are college students, right?
Mm-hmm.
In this research with college students, I find that negative racial attitudes and also right-wing ideology are both determinants of white students' opposition to affirmative action. Because in the past, some of the literature argued that self-interest would be one of the reasons why whites do not support affirmative action, but I do not find that in Brazil. Another important result on this research is that I also find that individuals with greater political knowledge, they tend to express greater support for affirmative action. The main mechanism in play here is that higher political knowledge provides individuals with an awareness of the democratic norms and political tolerance within the democratic regime and society, and this tends to reduce racial prejudice. And in this sense, it leads to greater support for affirmative action. But this relationship is reversed when we look at those with high political knowledge and strong right-wing belief systems. So those who define themselves as right-wing and also know a lot about politics, then their opposition to affirmative action becomes stronger.
A bit ago, you talked about threat as animating at least Bolsonaro's voters, but the right-wing voters. And so I've made the argument, and this is not unique to me, and it's not controversial, that far-right nationalist movements globally have kind of three tenets to them. One threat is immigration. One threat is an existing governmental structure, and another threat is a catch-all would be like non-traditional communities. So I imagine here like the queer community or equity for women, et cetera. And in Brazil, I'm familiar with Bolsonaro's overt homophobia and the misogyny, but I'm not so familiar with immigration as being an issue. So I guess I'm wondering, can we bumper sticker what is the threat in Brazilian politics?
Yeah, so I think you're correct. There's these two pillars of far-right nationalist belief systems hold up in Brazil: the anti-government, the non-traditional communities opposition. But in Brazil, there's a lot of controversy and pushback over indigenous rights in the Amazon from Bolsonaro and other right-wing leaders. In Brazil, there's also a growth of the importance of religion through evangelical leaders and politicians. Other scholars may say that is populism would be another pillar in Brazil. But, well, myself, I would say that the third structuring thing of the far right in Brazil is the authoritarian beliefs, because they tap in this wide variety of political and social conservative issues. So talking about threat, which is the main mechanism of affecting these authoritarian beliefs, there is a long history of research on authoritarianism investigating the role of these different threats in activating the authoritarian dispositions. So there is experimental evidence that shows that a perceived threat can change the cognitive strategies employed by the authoritarian individuals to search for information in the environment. There is also research that tries to understand what matters more, right? Is it economic threat? Is it a social threat? So Feldman and Stanner has this paper that they don't find any relationship between economic threats and authoritarianism, such as unemployment levels or economic distress in the country, but they find a relationship between perceived societal threats and authoritarianism. So gender norms, LGBT rights, all of these non-economic but social and political changes in the social norms that tend to affect the perceptions of threat of authoritarians. I can also talk about how the reorganization of the right in Brazil involved three major trends with regard to the supply of conservative candidates. So first, there is this growth of the religious right, which is associated with the advance of now Pentecostal Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
So when we compare Brazil with other Latin American countries, the evangelical churches have been extraordinarily successful in the Brazilian arena. So until very recently, evangelical politicians, they always existed, but they adopted this more like pragmatic and non-ideological strategies. So there was like seeking space in a wide variety of political parties, and they were making alliances with candidates from the right to the left. But recently, they changed their strategy and start pursuing this more like ideological agenda. Another important change that really reorganized the political arena in Brazil is the rise of conservative social movements that emerged mostly in the protests in favor of the impeachment of Dilma herself between 2015 and 16. So many of these movements were created by young right-wing activists. So like really young people, some of them even teenagers,
Mm-hmm.
because they felt that their ideas were not represented due to some sort of cultural homogeneity of the left in the media, in academia, in government. And the third one would be basically this new radical alternatives in the electoral market that created this rise of this populist right organized mostly in the PSL, which was the party that served as the vehicle for the election of Bolsonaro.
Does Bolsonaro accept the results of the election if he loses? And if not, is Brazil's democracy strong enough to withstand that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I think long before January 6th in the US,
Mm-hmm.
and right after Bolsonaro's election victory, many pundits, voters, political observers, they have been warning about the possibility of a coup.
Mm-hmm.
So people went even further, suggesting like a deep division and polarization in Brazilian politics. But I believe that this is mostly social cognition bias than an actual threat to Brazilian democracy. The main reason I think that is because these highly concerned individuals, they tend to be the most interested, the most involved, and emotionally attached to politics. So I see three main explanations for why people believe a coup could happen in Brazil. Being politically involved, the media environment, and social networks. So these three factors, they kind of fit back on each other. So I'm going to start with the first, which is being politically involved. So there are large amounts of evidence in political science that those most interested, those most knowledgeable about politics, they tend to have the most extreme policy positions, to be exposed and search more political information. They tend to have higher misperceptions about their political opponents, and of course, stronger emotional reactions to political happening. So the second reason that I'm arguing here is the media business. So the media business model that we have nowadays has been a 24/7 coverage. So journalists, they need any sort of political content, event to fill the television schedule. So as a result, the most mundane and random events, they might have hours and hours dedicated to it.
Mm-hmm.
So that affects the perceptions of these happenings, especially the media tends to focus on political conflict and polarization, which tends to bolster the audience levels and perceptions of negativity and polarization about politics. Then the third reason is the social networks, which is the idea that people end up surrounded by people that they that think similarly. So people that think like them. I can give you an example here. So let's suppose we have this person called Rachel. Rachel, she felt that she could not discuss her love for Star Wars or let's say Taylor Swift or soccer with her family. So she actively sought out others with whom she felt more comfortable talking about Star Wars, soccer, or Taylor Swift. It's also possible that Rachel may have found herself in a group of friends or working in an office full of people deeply involved in these topics. And eventually she grew to be deeply involved herself as well. So this is the same in politics. And this is consequential for the perceptions of their political opponents. Why? Well, because one of the main psychological characteristics of these people who are deeply involved with something is the will and need to express their opinions publicly. Political psychology research shows that by expressing and sharing your opinions and identities serves multiple purposes and motives. So that can be a search for meaning for the political happenings, right? Let's say, oh, Bolsonaro was 4 hours late for a meeting, what he was doing. So people start to create all sorts of theories why he was late for a meeting. And maybe he was late for a meeting just because, let's say, their airplane was late. Mm-hmm. So people are trying to search for meaning. People are trying to reduce anxiety because they get the sense that they know too much. So expressing their ideas to others helps alleviate this feeling of anxiety. And there is even also this moral sense of informing others about politics. So I know so much about politics that I should inform other people about it. This is likely to happen in social media platforms because where a short opinion post can get this immediate response in likes as a form of social support to one's position, one's ideas, or simply loyalty to their political affiliation. So I don't believe Bolsonaro will be able to organize and orchestrate a coup or similar movement. But I should, at the same time, make clear that Brazilian political institutions are far from being a safeguard against a coup. However, I don't see the Brazilian political elites willing to agree and join Bolsonaro in supporting a non-democratic regime. Bolsonaro is facing several allegations of embezzlement, and recent new accusations include an investigation that found that his family has purchased over 50 homes, like mansions. So they bought over 50 homes and mansions in cash over 30 years, which is a very weird thing to do.
Well, isn't that, that's a process by which some people have used to launder money, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. Correct. And there's more. Brazil has been experiencing severe fragmentation in the party system configuration. So this phenomenon has been described by political scientists Cesar Zucco and Tim Power as hyper-fragmentation, which is basically a multi-party system that continues to fractionalize. The basic idea is what the authors call fragmentation without cleavages. So they find that the entry of new parties in the Brazilian political party system were not driven by polarization or issue-based differences, but by institutional changes of the electoral list composition, the federal party funding, and how parties manage the coalitions in the country. Because Brazil is a presidential system with coalitions. After 2010, the effective number of electoral parties in Brazil simply skyrocketed and more than doubled up to 2018. If I give you a ballpark of like how many political parties we have in Brazil right now, we have over like 25 parties. For political elites and candidates, it's more attractive than ever to be a dominant player in a small party than being part of like a big and well-established party. Why? Why is that? Well, it's because if you're a party leader in Brazil, politicians, they become their own playmaker in the sense that the legislation allows congressmen to obtain public party funds to their own party, no matter who's the president. Because the funds, they have been distributed in a super decentralized fashion to build coalitions. Just to give a ballpark on the amount of money, in the 90s, the public party funds were just a couple million reais. So I think it was around like 3 million, 4 million reais. But in 2018, it was over 700 million. So it in less than 10 years increased like over almost 200 times. And also recently, the Congress also created a separate fund for TV campaigns of almost 2 million reais. So this is more than twice of the original public party funds that I just mentioned. So now, if you agree that politicians are strategic players, the easiest and the quickest way to control these public funds is to become the state level leader of a small party instead of trying to rise through the ranks of a larger one. And this is exactly what the authors, Cesar and team, showed. There is an increase in the number of the state level parties that are dominated by a single politician. To summarize, I don't really believe in a regime change in Brazil because Brazilian politicians, they will never give up on this huge increase in the amount of public funds that can be sequestrated by these politicians who can control their own party within their home states. But support for democracy, it's something that changes a lot over time. And we might have Brazilians who fully support a coup by Bolsonaro. But I think these individuals, they're a small number of the population. These individuals are likely to be the strong authoritarians that we've been talking, and likely Bolsonaro's most resolute supporters. The real danger is the Brazilian Congress passing laws to benefit only themselves, like they have been doing, or laws that limit the rights of certain social groups in the country, right? So if democratic support weakens even in long-established democracies like the US, and some citizens are willing to act against democracy, then the ability of any democracy to retain support of the majority of the citizens in the future is really uncertain. Because if authoritarians like Trump, Bolsonaro, or Cas in Chile are elected purely because they represent an option available within the political arena, then we could say that the risks to democracy might not be too serious. And then it really depends on our democratic institutions, the political elites, to work as a protective barrier against the rise of these autocrats in democratic regimes.
Okay. Final question, and this one's the tough one. What is something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately? And it doesn't have to be related to this topic, but it can be.
Related to this topic, there's a political psychology paper that I highly recommend. It's a piece on political behavior journal from Drew Engelhardt and colleagues entitled Advancing the Measurement of Authoritarianism. And as the title suggests, they show how we can improve our survey measures of this concept by asking a broader set of these child-rearing questions that I hope to field in Brazil sometime soon. For those interested in more like comparative politics, there is a paper on authoritarianism that I also recommend. It's called The Ideological Shadow of Authoritarianism from Elias Dinas and Kenya Northmore Ball, which was published in the Comparative Political Studies journal. It's not a political psychology paper, so it's not about individuals. but they propose a really strong theory on the idea that dictatorships are not ideologically neutral. So they compare Latin America and Eastern Europe, which are two regions that had different ideological tinted dictatorships, but both exhibit the same outcome. Authoritarian regimes are negatively evaluated by most of the citizens and elites after democratization. So it's very interesting paper. I highly recommend papers that compare Latin America and Eastern Europe. It's very interesting regions.
Okay.
For those interested in something less technical, I highly recommend How to Become a Tyrant on Netflix. So this is a very legit documentary, heavily based on what we know about authoritarian tactics, diminishing democracy and manipulating public opinion. So it's on Netflix. And I would say outside this era of authoritarianism, I must recommend a new book from professors Yana Krupnikov and John Barry Ryan. The name is The Other Divide. I recently finished reading this book, and this is a great book because it challenged the nature and the extent of political polarization by showing that there is this other divide in American politics. They argue that there is these people who are deeply involved in politics and those who are not. So I don't want to go over deeply on this because this is a topic for another episode. But in general lines, the idea is that the US society is divided in a group of those who really care about politics and are very expressive about their political views. And there is this other group that is much less involved in the day-to-day politics.
Oh my God, Rob, do you ever stop working? I thought you were going to say that you listen to Taylor Swift, you watch soccer, and you watch Star Wars.
Yeah, not really. Like I don't read like fiction. I only read academic stuff. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
All right. On that note, Dr. Vidigal, thanks for taking the time to be here today and chat with me about this.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Brazil faces the same crisis that we in the United States did on January 6th, and we continue to face as a result. In the United States, we often hear that we should be proud of our institutional checks for holding against the insurrection, perhaps coup attempt, following the 2020 election. And in places like Italy, optimists suggest that the institutional design will temper the worst excesses or desires of the far right's agenda in their newly forming government. And likewise, as Dr. Vidigal suggests, the design of Brazilian institutions would make it extremely difficult for anyone, including Jair Bolsonaro, to execute a successful coup. But even when and if these institutions fend off such attacks, even if the checks built into our systems withhold these challenges, they are inflicting a damage that could ultimately result in the democratic collapse. Following the January 6th insurrection, and despite the fact that the insurrectionists failed in their immediate goal, I feel a sense of weakness in American democracy, a lost faith, frankly, that the system would hold against a more determined, more sophisticated attack. And Brazilians must be feeling this now too. Italians and Swedes might be feeling this, Canadians and the French as well. For now, it feels like psychological warfare, rattling our nerves, shaking our confidence, undermining our faith. And without that confidence and faith in our institutions, in our democracy, then why would we fight for it? It feels as if it is only a matter of time. And if Bolsonaro does refuse to accept unfavorable results, and he does refuse to leave office, this will be one more step in the global tilt toward authoritarianism. If, however, Bolsonaro does lose and does leave office peacefully, maybe there is some hope for the rest of us. But there is still much work that must be done to shore up our institutions, to rebuild faith and confidence, because it is this that is the bedrock of stability and legitimacy of democracy. Our faith in institutions is equally important as the strength of those institutions. Okay, next week, I'm talking to Frank Mugisha, a queer rights advocate and activist in Uganda, and the executive director of Sexual Minorities Uganda. Frank has won numerous international awards for his advocacy and been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. In August, the Ugandan government shut down Sexual Minorities Uganda and actively targeted Frank for arrest and prosecution for violating Uganda's draconian anti-gay laws. Depending on the charges, Frank and other queer people in Uganda could face the death penalty. I'll talk to Frank about his life, his work, living under threat of death, and how the rest of the world can help. Chat soon, folks.